There are some feelings that are difficult to explain because they don't arrive with a grand confession. They arrive quietly, in the way someone keeps looking for you in a crowd, in the way they remember small things you once said, in the way, after 4 years, they still find a reason to see you, even though they have never found the courage to tell you why. Imagine caring about someone for 4 years and never saying the words, "I love you." Not because the feeling isn't real, not because you don't want to tell them, but because somewhere along the way, fear becomes louder than desire. You start thinking, what if she doesn't feel the same way? What if telling her changes everything? What if I lose even the small place I have in her life? And so you stay silent. You see her when you can. You talk to her when there's an opportunity. You carry on with your life, but every now and then something reminds you of her, and suddenly that feeling comes back. And perhaps she has absolutely no idea. This is one of the strangest things about human relationships. Sometimes the person who thinks about you the most may be the person who tells you the least. But here's what we have to understand. Silence isn't automatically proof of love. Someone can be shy, uncertain, emotionally unavailable, or simply afraid of rejection. So rather than romanticizing silence, we have to look at the behavior underneath it, because behavior tells us something. Imagine this man. For 4 years, whenever he misses this woman, he finds himself wanting to see her. He doesn't necessarily have a dramatic plan. He doesn't arrive with flowers and a speech prepared. Sometimes he simply wants to be near her. Now, maybe he knows where he might run into her. Maybe he takes the longer route because there's a chance she'll be there. Maybe he sees her from a distance and suddenly his entire mood changes. And then he goes home without saying what he really wanted to say. Now ask yourself, what is happening psychologically? When someone becomes emotionally significant to us, our attention starts behaving differently. We notice things connected to that person, places become associated with them, songs remind us of them, certain times of day bring memories back. The brain begins creating an emotional map around the person. That's why missing someone isn't simply a thought, it's an experience. You don't just think, "I miss her." You suddenly remember her voice. You remember the way she laughed. You remember something completely ordinary that happened 3 years ago, and somehow that ordinary moment feels incredibly important. And this is where people often misunderstand attraction. They think love is always loud. They expect someone to announce it, prove it, demonstrate it dramatically. But sometimes attraction is quiet. Sometimes it's the person who keeps showing up. Sometimes it's the person who remembers. Sometimes it's the person who has had countless opportunities to forget, but somehow never quite manages to. But here's the important part. If you're the woman in this story, don't immediately turn every small behavior into evidence that a man is secretly in love with you. That's where self-respect comes in. You don't want to become a detective in your own relationship. You don't want to spend every night analyzing whether a 3-word text means something deeper. You don't want to build an entire love story from clues that may or may not exist, because eventually healthy attraction has to move from interpretation to communication. And that is where everything changes. You can have chemistry. You can have longing. You can have years of memories. But a relationship cannot be built entirely from what one person secretly feels. At some point, someone has to become brave enough to make the invisible visible. Now imagine what 4 years of silence can do to a person's mind. At first you might think, "I'll tell her eventually." Then months pass, then another year. And eventually the silence becomes part of your identity. You become the person who loves quietly. And strangely, the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to speak. Because now you're not only afraid of rejection, you're afraid of destroying 4 years of hope. You're afraid that the answer might be no. You're afraid that the person you've idealized may not see you in the same way. And perhaps the deepest fear isn't even rejection. Perhaps it's embarrassment, the fear that someone will discover how much you've cared. Think about that. Why can vulnerability feel so dangerous? Because when you tell someone you care, you give them information they can use to hurt you. You're saying, "This matters to me." And suddenly they have the power to respond. They can say yes, they can say no, or sometimes even harder, they can say nothing. But emotional courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something matters enough to be honest about despite the fear. And this applies to you too. Maybe you've been waiting for someone to make their feelings obvious. Maybe you're constantly asking yourself, does he like me? But perhaps the better question is, what kind of relationship do I want to create? Because if you want something healthy, you don't want to spend years decoding another person's silence. You want someone who eventually has the courage to communicate. And if you're the person who has been hiding your feelings, perhaps the lesson is even more uncomfortable. You cannot expect someone to understand a story you've never told them. You can hope they notice. You can hope they feel it. You can hope they somehow know. But hope is not communication. And this is where self-worth becomes incredibly important. Self-worth isn't saying, I don't need anyone. That's not confidence. Confidence is saying, I can deeply care about someone and I can still survive whatever answer they give me. That's strength. That's emotional maturity. Because the goal isn't to guarantee that someone will love you. The goal is to become someone who is capable of expressing love without abandoning yourself in the process. So if you've spent years watching someone from a distance, missing them, thinking about them, wondering what could happen, ask yourself something very honest. Am I protecting myself from rejection, or am I protecting myself from possibility? Because those two things can look identical from the outside. You remain silent. You don't make the move. You continue your routine. Nothing changes. But internally, one is fear and the other is choice. And sometimes the life you want is sitting on the other side of one uncomfortable conversation. Not a dramatic confession, not a speech designed to pressure someone, just honesty. I've realized that I care about you as more than a friend, and I wanted to be honest about that. I don't expect you to feel the same way, but I didn't want fear to make this decision for me. That's what emotional courage sounds like. It doesn't demand. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't say, after everything I've done for you, you owe me a chance. It simply tells the truth. And if the answer is yes, something beautiful can finally begin. If the answer is no, something else begins. Clarity. Because sometimes clarity hurts for a moment, but uncertainty can hurt for years. And perhaps that's the real lesson behind the man who has loved her for 4 years without ever telling her. Love is not only about how intensely you feel, it's also about what you're willing to do with that feeling, because 4 years of emotion can remain a secret. But one honest moment can change everything. There is something deeply human about loving someone quietly for a long time, not because the feeling is small, but sometimes because the feeling is so important that saying it out loud feels terrifying. Imagine knowing someone for 4 years. Imagine seeing her, talking to her, noticing the little things about her that perhaps she doesn't even realize you notice. And every time you think, maybe today I'll finally tell her, something inside you says, not yet. Not because you don't care, because you care too much. And this is where people misunderstand silence. They assume that if a man doesn't confess his feelings, he must not have them. But human beings are far more complicated than that. Sometimes silence is indifference, but sometimes silence is fear. And the difference is found not in one dramatic gesture, but in the pattern of someone's behavior. Think about this man for 4 years. Whenever he misses her, he finds a reason to go where he might see her. He doesn't necessarily walk up and announce his feelings. He may simply want to be near her. Maybe he sees her from a distance. Maybe he hopes for a conversation. Maybe even a few seconds in her presence are enough to make him feel connected to something he has been carrying inside for years. Now you might say, why doesn't he just tell her? Now that's the obvious question. But here's what most people never realize. Confession doesn't only create the possibility of love, it creates the possibility of rejection. And when someone has emotionally invested in a person for years, rejection doesn't feel like losing a date. It can feel like losing a fantasy, a hope, and a private world they've been protecting. So they delay. They tell themselves, I'll tell her when the timing is right. Then another month passes, then another year, and eventually the silence itself becomes a habit. This is where fear becomes incredibly powerful, because the longer you keep something inside, the harder it becomes to reveal it. At first, saying I like you feels difficult. After 4 years, saying I've loved you for 4 years can feel almost impossible. Because now the confession carries history. It carries every moment he remembers. Every time he saw her, every time he wanted to speak, every opportunity he missed. And suddenly he's not only risking her rejection, he's confronting his own regret. But there's another psychological layer here that matters. Sometimes we don't approach the person we love because we have created an image of what the relationship could be. In our imagination, everything is safe. You can imagine her smiling at you. You can imagine the conversation going perfectly. You can imagine the two of you finally admitting what you've both felt. But imagination never has to deal with awkward silence. Reality does. And that's why some people become incredibly brave in their thoughts and incredibly hesitant in real life. They have the entire conversation in their head. They just never have it with the person. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've liked someone and analyzed every message they sent. Maybe you wondered whether their smile meant something. Maybe you waited for a perfect moment that never arrived. And eventually you realized that the problem wasn't that you didn't know what you felt. The problem was that you were terrified of what would happen if the other person knew. But there is something important I want you to understand about this kind of situation. Love is not proven simply by how long someone waits. 4 years of feelings can be meaningful, but time alone doesn't make a relationship healthy. You have to look at whether the person is willing to eventually become emotionally honest, because there is a difference between patience and avoidance. Patience says, I care about this, so I want to approach it thoughtfully. Avoidance says, I care about this, so I will never risk finding out what is real. And that distinction can completely change how you understand someone's behavior. If this man repeatedly goes to see her because he misses her, that tells us something about emotional attachment. But it doesn't automatically tell us what she feels. That's important. When you're emotionally invested in someone, your mind naturally starts collecting evidence. She looked at me. She remembered something I said. She smiled when I arrived. He came to see me again. She seemed nervous. And suddenly, every small interaction becomes a potential clue. But attraction isn't a detective case where you have to solve every tiny signal. At some point, healthy connection requires communication. This is where self-respect becomes incredibly important. If you are the person waiting for someone to finally confess their feelings, don't spend your life trying to decode them. You can create opportunities for honest communication without chasing. You can be warm. You can be open. You can make conversation. You can let someone know that you're comfortable around them. but you don't have to carry the entire emotional responsibility for the relationship. Because if someone has feelings for you, eventually they have to take some ownership of those feelings. That's what courage looks like. Not having no fear. Having fear and still choosing honesty. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about this story is that the man doesn't necessarily need to become someone else to express what he feels. He doesn't need some perfect line. He doesn't need a manipulation technique. He doesn't need to create jealousy. He doesn't need to disappear for 3 weeks hoping she'll chase him. He simply needs honesty. Something as simple as, I've realized that I've cared about you for a long time, and I've been afraid to say it because I didn't want to change what we have, but I don't want to keep hiding how I feel. That's not weakness. That's emotional courage. And notice something else. That statement doesn't demand anything from her. It doesn't say, you owe me a relationship because I've loved you for 4 years. It says, this is my truth, and I'm giving you the freedom to decide what your truth is. That is what healthy vulnerability looks like. And this is where everything changes. Because the goal of expressing love isn't to control the other person's response. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself through silence. You can be rejected and still have self-respect. You can discover that someone doesn't feel the same and still know that your feelings were genuine. You can walk away from an unanswered love without deciding that you weren't worthy of being loved. And sometimes the greatest transformation doesn't happen when the other person finally says yes. It happens when you finally become brave enough to stop hiding. Because imagine carrying the same feeling for another 4 years. Imagine reaching 8 years and still thinking, maybe one day. At some point, the question isn't, will she ever love me? The deeper question becomes, how long am I willing to keep my life on pause because I'm afraid of the answer? And that is a question worth asking yourself, whether you're the man in this story or the woman waiting for him, because love deserves courage, not pressure, not manipulation, not games. Courage, the courage to communicate, the courage to listen. And perhaps most importantly, the courage to accept reality when it doesn't match the story you've created in your head. Because real love isn't simply the intensity of what you feel when someone is far away. Real love is what happens when two people are brave enough to meet each other in reality. And sometimes one honest conversation can do what 4 years of silence never could. And this is where you have to be careful, because there is a very romantic idea that says, if I love someone enough, eventually they will realize it. But relationships don't work that way. Someone can be deeply moved by your presence and still not understand what you feel. Someone can enjoy seeing you and still interpret your behavior as friendship. Someone can even suspect that you have feelings and still be waiting for you to confirm it. This is why unspoken love can become such a strange emotional prison. You are close enough to feel something, but not close enough to know whether it is mutual. You see them, but you don't truly know them in the way that a relationship requires. Now, you imagine the possibility, but you haven't experienced the reality. And the longer this continues, the more your mind can become attached not only to the person, but to the possibility of the person. That's a huge distinction. Because sometimes what you're protecting isn't a relationship, it's a possibility. And possibilities are incredibly easy to idealize. You don't have to deal with their flaws. You don't have to navigate disagreements. You don't have to discover whether your values actually match. You only have to imagine the beautiful version. That's why telling the truth can feel so frightening. Truth replaces fantasy with reality, and reality is uncertain. But here's the paradox. Uncertainty is also where real connection begins. If he finally tells her how he feels, several things can happen. She might say she feels the same. She might be surprised and need time to process it. She might say she cares deeply but only sees him as a friend. None of those responses erase the 4 years. They simply reveal what those 4 years actually were. And sometimes that's painful. But clarity can be painful and still be liberating. Think about the emotional energy that goes into waiting. You notice when she is online. You wonder who she is talking to. You think about whether she has someone else. You replay conversations. You create scenarios. You ask yourself whether today is the day you should finally say something. That constant uncertainty can consume enormous emotional energy. And this is why confidence matters so much in relationships. Confidence isn't the belief that someone will choose you. Confidence is the belief that you will be okay even if they don't. That is a completely different kind of strength. When you know you can survive rejection, you no longer have to make rejection impossible. And once you stop trying to make rejection impossible, you become more capable of genuine intimacy. Because intimacy requires risk. You cannot have real emotional closeness while controlling every possible outcome. You have to allow another person to have a choice. And strangely enough, giving someone that freedom is one of the most respectful things you can do. So if you're the person who has been waiting for someone to notice your feelings, ask yourself something very honest. What would I do if I knew I couldn't be embarrassed? Would you talk to them? Would you ask them to spend time with you? Would you tell them that you enjoy being around them? Would you finally admit that there is something more than friendship in your heart? You don't need to make some dramatic confession in front of everyone. You don't need a movie scene. Start with a small truth. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a while. Then pause. Let yourself breathe and say what is real. Because courage doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes courage sounds like a quiet sentence spoken with a shaking voice. And if you're the woman in this story, there's something important for you too. If you suspect that a man has feelings for you, but he never says anything, don't spend months or years trying to decode every signal. Give the relationship room for honesty. If you feel comfortable, you can create an opening. You can say, I always enjoy talking to you. You can invite him to spend time with you. You can ask questions that move the conversation beyond small talk. You can show warmth without pretending to know what he feels. But don't turn yourself into an emotional detective. Because your worth isn't determined by whether you can correctly interpret someone's behavior. Your worth is determined by the fact that you deserve relationships where communication eventually becomes clear. That's the standard, not perfection, not certainty from day one. Clarity over time, consistency over confusion, mutual effort over one-sided longing. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one man and one woman. It becomes a lesson about the lives we create when we're afraid to act. How many opportunities have you postponed because you were waiting to feel completely ready? How many conversations have you avoided because you were afraid of what they might reveal? How many times have you said, maybe later, when what you really meant was, I'm scared? You don't need to eliminate fear before you move. You need to stop treating fear as a command. Fear can sit in the passenger seat. It doesn't have to drive. And if this man has genuinely carried these feelings for 4 years, perhaps the next chapter shouldn't be about finding another clever way to hide them. Perhaps it should be about becoming honest. Not because honesty guarantees love. It doesn't. Honesty guarantees something else. It guarantees that you're living in reality. And reality, even when painful, gives you something that fantasy never can, a direction. If she says yes, you can finally build something real. If she says no, you can finally grieve something real and open your life to something else. But if you remain silent, you stay suspended between hope and fear. And that is often the most exhausting place to live. So if you're listening to this and there is someone you've loved quietly, someone you've thought about again and again, someone you keep finding reasons to see, maybe don't ask yourself, how can I make them fall for me? Ask a better question. How can I show up honestly and let them decide whether they want to meet me there? That question changes everything. Because love isn't about convincing someone. It's about revealing yourself and discovering whether the two of you can choose each other. And if they can, beautiful. If they can't, painful as that may be, you haven't failed. You have learned, you have grown, you have chosen courage over hiding. And that is something you can carry into every relationship that comes after. Never confuse silence with strength. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is finally say the thing you've been afraid to say. Not to force an outcome, not to demand an answer, but simply because your heart deserves to live in the truth. 4 years is a long time to carry a secret. But it doesn't have to become another 4.